The overall objective of Native Bound Unbound Archive of Indigenous Slavery is to document every instance of Indigenous slavery across the Western Hemisphere.
This sounds like a humongous task.
It is, and you know, it's one that we're not daunted by. The team that I've been able to build over the past year and a half, a constellation of teams, is not daunted by the task of it, even though it is enormous. As we say, name by name, document by document, story by story.
And how does it work out? Like, what documents are you getting access to kind of find these stories?
So it's not just documents, it's artifacts, it's buildings, anything, it's the archaeological record, anything that tells us a little bit about the presence and the experience of those people who were captured and bound in any form of servitude from 1492 all the way to the 1930s.
Even the 1930s?
Well, you know, some people were held, even in this community of San Luis, all the way to their death, still being listed in census records, in federal census records, as servants. Still living in the household of often children or grandchildren of their former enslavers. So you ask what type of documents. We are looking at sacramental records, which I think will be a bulk of the material. That is to say, baptismal records, marriage records, burial records, but last wills and testaments, probate records, all kinds of types of records that exist, anything. The team is pulling them up in archives around the world.
Yeah. And this is a history that largely has been, what's the proper word to kind of talk about this history? Has this history been erased, suppressed, forgotten? I mean, maybe all three?
I think all three of those words apply, Jeremy. And it's been silenced, it's been obscured. Let me talk a little bit about that. I mean, slavery under the Spanish Empire, and I should say we are looking at all of the empires because we're looking at the entire scope of the Americas, British, Portuguese, the Dutch, Spanish, French, and even under the American imperial rule, it's actually been obscured. But under the Spanish Empire, it was outlawed in 1542 under the new laws. But it continued as I often say, a tolerated illegality, because there were exceptions even under the law. If people were captured under under rescate, if they were rescued, or under the just war clause, the colonizers got to determine what was a just war, by the way. But if they were captured in that way, it was legally sanctioned.
Almost like a loophole.
It was a loophole. Yeah. The law became a loophole for how people continue to be enslaved over all these years. And so, but as a consequence of it being rendered illegal, all kinds of euphemisms were developed. Yeah. That is, rather than saying the term esclavo or slave, all these other terms became developed. Navorio, yaconas, sirviente, criado, all of these terms got developed. And in some cases, those terms developed even into ethnic categories. In our region here, Genízaro was one of those terms.
Genízaro. And that's the word that is really popping up for me, because I'm starting to see that word now pop up now more over the years as people start to learn about the Genízaros in their family tree.
Yes. It's true.
Especially in this region in northern New Mexico and southern Colorado.
In this region, it's become a term that people have adopted, and almost to even define their own sense of identity. But strictly speaking, Genízaro actually was not even used after the 1820s. All of those caste categories were abolished after the 1820s in the New Mexico region, throughout Mexico. Yeah. But it's a term that was more recently adopted. So people even in this community who were captured and enslaved would never have been called a Genízaro. Yeah. But they were the most popular term, and we'll see this as we start to gather these records, was criado.
Criado. And what does criado mean? Like,
Well, it comes from the verb criar, which means to be reared or raised in a home. But it became a euphemism because I used the term malcriado, but it means to be
malcriado.
raised.
Yeah.
I mean, as we know, malcriado means like
You're misbehaving.
Yeah. But when I wrote my dissertation, I coined the term malcriado to define what it means to be raised Indian in the wrong place. It was indigenous people who were misplaced, captured and misplaced in communities that were not their own, in families that were not their own, separated from their ancestral origins, from their home origins, and being raised and reared in. To be raised and reared actually obscures the enslavement of these people. They were more than servants, they were enslaved people. I claim the term enslaved because when we even use the term indentured or servant, that continues to obscure what actually happened with these people. They were separated, they were captured, they were placed in a subservient role within communities.
Yeah, and their identities were lost and erased.
Absolutely.
As Native peoples. Let's talk about Southern Colorado. You're finding with your project, and this has been a lifelong project and passion for you. You're finding that this has been happening all over northern New Mexico and Colorado, more so than we realize.
It is foundational. It's foundational in the Americas, but it certainly is foundational in the colonization and settlement of New Mexico. I think of, as I was driving today from Santa Fe up here, one of my ancestors, and an ancestor for many people, her name was Doña Inés. She was one of the individuals taken from a pueblo that no longer exists in the 1590s. And she was brought up by Juan de Oñate in 1598. And she was captured by a Portuguese slaver in that era and then taken to Mexico City, brought back by Oñate. So from that moment on, from the 1590s all the way to the present, all the way to the early 20th century, people were captured and held. Southern Colorado, as you know, was part of northern New Mexico. And so it didn't become Colorado until 1861. But that was a really interesting moment, I think, because it was right as the nation as a whole was debating this issue of slavery generally. And they were talking generally about African slavery, African American slavery. But here in the territories of Colorado and New Mexico, it continued to happen. Yeah. And there's a whole story behind that as well.
As people learn about their ancestors, people who identify as Latino, Hispanic, Chicano, what is that doing to people's identity that you've talked to and descendants that you've told, like, hey, we found your ancestor here who was enslaved?
I think of one of my favorite writers, Eduardo Galeano, who wrote, "Identity is no museum piece, sitting stock still under a piece of glass." And we've come to understand our heritage, our sense of identity in this region, kind of in static terms, right? And a lot of that identity was created in the late 19th, early 20th century, where people started calling themselves Spanish, and really recognizing and affiliating with a European side of their identity. And that's certainly part of their identity, but it's much more complex, much more complex. It's my job as a historian, as an anthropologist, to actually pull back those layers. Literally, we're doing that with archives, we're doing that with places, there's even genetic research that is going on. And I actually want people to recognize the beauty and the complexity from where they come from. Yeah. Because it's actually a powerful story. Yeah. I think it's important to remember all of those ancestors, and it's been certainly one-sided in terms of how that's happened over the past 100 years or so. And it's not it's not an exception. It's truly foundational. I mean, as we start to explore the records, you can't open a baptismal book in this region and not find 2 or 3 enslaved individuals in each page after page after page.
It was so prevalent.
It was so prevalent. So when I say it was foundational, it truly was. I argued in my doctoral dissertation over 20 years ago, there's not a single Nuevo Mexicano, and by that I mean of this entire region in Colorado as well, who cannot trace their ancestry back to at least one individual who was enslaved and indigenous. And it's more than just one. And this project will start to show that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I was reading that and I don't know if this came from your studies, but I think I read somewhere at one point, 1/3 of people in New Mexico were Genízaros.
Yes.
At one point.
In the 1770s, there was a report, an assessment done of the population, and that's where that figure comes from.
What is the accessibility for the public to look at your project? Is this something eventually people will be able to have access to?
Open source website. Yeah. As one of our researchers said, Estevan, you haven't even finished your book, and we're going to give it all away. We're putting all of this research out there. And I said, that's the point. Uh-huh. This information belongs to the people wherever they are, in Peru, in Canada, or right here in San Luis, Colorado. That's the whole point. We don't have the website up yet, but in about a year, it'll be fully accessible to the large public. And you know, when the president of the Mellon Foundation asks, who are you doing this for? It'll be available to the general public, to other scholars, to educators, to artists, to other storytellers like you. But I said, let me tell you who we're doing this for, and that's for descendant communities, for individuals to be able to identify where their ancestors lived and the fact that they survived this experience.
This is a remarkable project, and how long do you think it'll take until you can finally say we're done, or is it going to never be done?
I don't, given the scope of it, that we have said that we are going to digitize every document, and we are already up to thousands of documents. And there are places that we haven't even started to explore, right? Smaller communities in Brazil or Buenos Aires or Trinidad, Colorado. I mean, there's so many places that we haven't pulled up the records. It's going to be a project in process for, I think, decades. It's going to be a lifetime project.
So when did you first start? When did you actually start getting your fingers dirty with the artifacts, the home identifications, and the document turning?
Well, I started in the 1990s, truly, as a doctoral student, started to gather information. I went to the courthouse here in San Luis and gathered testimonies of individuals in 1868 who were declaring their freedom. But in declaring their freedom, it was also a declaration of the fact that they had been enslaved in this community. So I've been doing this for 1990s, but the project Native Bound Unbound was launched in 2022, January of 2022, thanks to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation that supported it.
What do you find most surprising to you personally as you kind of go through these documents and these things, these elements that you're looking at? What is really jumping out for you?
I've been at this for so long that there's very little that surprises me, to be honest with you. But what I'm learning every day as we do comparative analysis with other regions, and whether it's Cuba or Argentina or California or wherever, is how similar the languages of the enslavements and the experience. I mean, we're finding differences regionally for sure, but I'm actually astonished at how prevalent it was everywhere and how foundational it was everywhere. So as I think about the geography of slavery, for those of us scholars of New Mexico and of this region, we talk about certain communities, Jeremy, as Genízaro villages, places like Abiquiu, places like that you're familiar with, San Jose, Belén, all of these places. But what I have learned over the years is that there's not a single community in this landscape and perhaps throughout the Americas that did not have at least one indigenous enslaved person in it. And hundreds. I mean, this village of San Luis had hundreds.
Hundreds. Yeah. This is a very, I mean, when you're talking about the past and you bring up this past and you're raising awareness about this past, and as we talked about, it does kind of shift identity, right? How have you learned, or how have you approached that, going into those waters? Because some people do get touchy when you do bring up, ancestral history of enslavement and indigenous enslavement, I would imagine.
In the 1990s, I was doing an interview with an elder in the Conejos area of southern Colorado, now very far from here. And he was talking about an ancestor of his who had been enslaved, a grandfather at this point. He was already in his 90s. And he said, it's taken me years to come to terms with what this means to me and the power of that. I mean, this is an elder telling that story. His granddaughter drives up as I'm finishing up the interview. And, those of us in this region, we want to know, who is this that's interrogating and talking to my grandfather? Who are you? And she approached me in that way, simply wanting to know who I was and what I was doing there. And I told her, and she said, I guess that doesn't look so good for our community. And I said, it depends on how you think of your sense of identity, right? And so, we're telling these stories because I think it not only troubles our sense of identity, but it also reveals the resilience and the complexity of how we think about identity and how we identify that. I think of when Maria Hinojosa was interviewing me a few years ago on Latino USA and said, how do you identify? She wanted a term, right? Chicano, Mexicano, Hispanic, indigenous, how do you identify? And I said, I can code switch, I can give you a term, but I'd rather tell you a story about how I identify. Let me tell you the story about my grandma Nea, who every time I visited her, and my great-grandmother in Pueblo, Colorado, told the same story every time we visited her of her ancestor, La India Panana, the Pawnee woman who was captured and enslaved, and why she continued to remember her, and why my grandma Nea was telling me that story. And Maria interrupted me and said, we don't have time for stories, Estevan. We don't have time for stories. And I said, but that's how it's only by storytelling by which we're going to come to understand a deeper sense of our identity.
Because it's so complex, you can't really it's like you cannot categorize with simple terms.
No.
Identity.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I said, those of us who are gathering these stories, we're not census takers, or we're not priests who are simply wanting to write down a sense of identity. We want to pull out the complexity and really explore that. We want to have conversations.
Hard conversations. Why is it that, and we touched upon this a little bit, there's like been a sense of shame over this history?
Yeah.
Why?
It's, it is, there's stigma that's always been involved. There's been stigma in terms of what it means to be a descendant of an enslaved person. That's certainly true, because it somehow makes that person less than, that they were captured and bound and they were subservient. There's also stigma in being indigenous, right? In that era. And we are now seeing people who are reclaiming that, understanding the resilience and the power of what that means. And that just gives me shivers to think about the fact that we can reclaim that and understand the greater complexity of meaning behind that.
It's almost like you're reaching back and acknowledging your ancestor, that they were human beings.
They were human beings in spite of the fact that the social system dehumanized them.